Welcome back, and welcome to the first panel of the day. Congratulations. Showing your dedication and support of fellow I'm pleased to introduce Matt Perry. He's a colleague here at CUNY at John Jay. He works on issues of slavery and gender in the Roman world. And he also, like all of us at CUNY, works in interdisciplinary fashion, teaching our diverse immigrant students here in New York City. He's chairing the panel Free Yet Bound, and I'll turn it over to Matt.
Great, thank you. All right, everyone hear me okay? Is it good? All right, good. Excellent. Welcome. Well, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to be moderating this panel here. It's kind of a diverse collection of papers, yet there's some common themes running through the papers that really kind of speak to my own interests. So it's wonderful to have a chance to kind of engage with these other scholars here. So my plan is I'll just introduce everyone, and then we can, I guess, each give the presentation, and then kind of come together and ask questions and have a discussion. Good? Good, okay. So our three speakers. Our first one is Yesenia Barragan, and her paper is entitled Accounting for Children, Slavery, Debt, and the Gradual Emancipation in Colombia. So Yesenia is a postdoctoral fellow at the Society of Fellows at Dartmouth College and a historian of Afro-Latin America. So in particular, she specializes in issues related to race, slavery, and emancipation in Colombia, the Andean region, and the Atlantic and Pacific worlds. She received her PhD in Latin American history from Colombia, and her current book project is now tentatively titled Frontiers of Freedom, Slavery, and Emancipation on the Colombian Pacific. Then our second speaker is Enrique Martino, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Göttingen in a research group entitled A Global Network for Global History. So Enrique took his PhD at Humboldt University in Berlin. He's published several articles about colonial labor and is working on a book tentatively entitled The Qualities of Excess, Articulations of Bridewealth and Contract Labor in a Spanish African Colonial Economy. And finally, our last speaker, Katharine Huemoeller, who is a member of the Department of Classical, Near Eastern, and Religious Studies at the University of British Columbia. And her specialty is Roman history. She received her doctorate in classics and a certificate in gender studies from Princeton. And her paper is titled Freedom in Marriage, ? Manumission, matrimonii, causa in the Roman World. Okay, so Yesenia.
No, we can get.
Oh, wait, Katharine. Okay.
Sorry.
It doesn't matter. Do you want to? What?
I do.
However you want. I feel you're up there.
Okay, we are slaves to our technological abilities.
Yeah. If I'm up there, then
Everyone, welcome our bravado.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for coming out this early morning. I'm sure some of you had adventures getting here, like I did I accidentally had to participate in the half marathon to get here, so I'm a little tired already. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you about a single family who lived in the city of Rome in the 1st century of the Common Era. And we know about this family from this funerary monument that I'm displaying here. The image in the center right here is of an 8-year-old girl, Junia Procula. Her parents, Marcus Junius Euphrosinus and her mother Acte, set this up for her because she died when she was 8. And that's a sad but very common story from the ancient world. But that's not all that we know about this family. So this is just a family tree. We have the father, the mother, and the daughter. So on the other side of the monument, there is a different text that tells us a lot more. And this is actually a curse that the husband, Euphrosinus, puts on his wife, Acte, when she leaves him after the death of their child at some point. We don't know when, but some point after. And this tells us that the family tree is actually much more complicated than my original sketch. It looks something like this. And as you can see, I'm indicating a proprietary or ownership relationship with the dotted line and a kin relationship with the solid line. So what we learn from this curse is that Acti had been Euphrosynes' slave before she was freed and then married to him. Her manumission made her a free woman, allowed her to bear a free child, Junia Procula, but it seems that she might have also had children before she was freed. So the curse records that when she left Euphrosynes for this other man, she took with her 2 children from the household. They were both slave children, a male child and a female child. We don't know if they were her children, but my guess is that they probably were. So this stone is very unusual, pretty cool. But the family history that it records is actually not so unusual. So I found, building on the work of Matthew Perry, about 300 inscriptions in total that record marriages between former slaves and former owners. And these come from all over the Roman world, all over the Western Roman world, the Latin-speaking Roman world. So I have just as 2 examples here, one on the left, right here, from the city of Rome, very small, modest, and then this extremely expensive, decorated monument that's from the outer reaches of the Roman Empire up in Britain. So they really span the gamut. And my topic is the relationship between these 2 legal procedures of manumission and marriage. So what did a manumission for marriage cost the enslaved woman, and what kind of freedom did it create? Well, in the case of the family that I just mentioned, we have some evidence for the former question, what manumission costed. In his curse on Acti for abandoning him, Euphrosynes asserts that Acti was manumitted gratis, free of charge. It's clear, though, whether or not money changed hands, that Euphrosynes did expect something in return for the grant of freedom, and that is marriage. The remainder of the curse, which is pictured here, in which he describes all the ways that Acti has cheated him, enumerates exactly what this marriage should have consisted of: sexual fidelity, companionship, and procreation. So, manumitted for free, she cheated her patron. The patron is the former owner, following an adulterer, and she abducted his slaves, a girl and a boy, from her patron while he lay in bed, so that he is left despondent, an old man, alone and despoiled. His language draws attention to the fact that he and Acti were bound by both proprietary and conjugal ties. By referring to himself, he's speaking in the third person here, by referring to himself as patron rather than as husband, and using this word cheat, which is associated with commercial fraud, he points to her violation of their proprietary relationship. She has failed to compensate him for this manumission by leaving him. At the same time, the identification of her new partner as an adulterer draws attention to their marital bond. And then he goes on to describe his pathetic state, right? He's alone and despoiled because she's removed from the household not only her own person, but also that of 2 young slaves. Since we know that Acti and Euphrosynes lost their daughter, Junia, when she was 8, perhaps he's alone in another way as well, not only slaveless and wifeless, but also childless and heirless. So his description of himself as an old man draws attention to his impending need for heirs, and I think it calls out Acti for the theft of her reproductive potential. So this stone serves as a fitting introduction to my argument that the manumission of female slaves like Acti for the purpose of marriage was not free. This might sound obvious to many of you, but what I'm sort of fighting against is a tendency in the scholarship on classical slavery to talk about manumission for the purposes of making someone a family member, right? Either a wife or the manumission of a child, a natural child, to be sort of a legitimate son. Those manumissions are often described as affectionate, right? They're based on love and affection, and they don't create any debt between the two parties. So what I think, though, is that freed wives paid for their freedom with their conjugal and reproductive labor. And this transaction was really formalized in Roman law. So a man who freed his slave for the purpose of marriage obtained exclusive rights to his freed wife's conjugal and reproductive labor, not just through the standard rights of marriage that are owed to any husband, but through a more controlling form of marriage. So in return for their manumission, freed wives experienced a less free version of marriage than other Roman wives, and a less free version of freedom than other freedmen and women. To examine the nature of this freedom that's acquired through marriage, we have to turn away from these inscriptions to perhaps a more dry set of material, legal texts. And these are the opinions of classical jurists. These are preserved in a commentary compiled at a later date, but they preserve these opinions of these legal experts from the 1st and 2nd century CE. And that's the sort of time period we're focusing on here. There was a grouping of laws related to the position of these freed wives in this period. They almost certainly didn't introduce the practice of freeing slaves to be a wife, but they formalized what was an existing custom, and they set the terms of the exchange, freedom granted in return for marriage. So the manumission of a slave for marriage was not inherently problematic in the Roman world. It was only men of the highest status, the senatorial elite, that were forbidden from marrying freed women, whether their own former slaves or someone else's. All other men eligible to contract marriage could do so with their freed women, and their right to do so was positively identified by one of the jurists, Ulpian. So where anyone wishes to manumit a female slave in order to marry her, and he can, without dishonor to his rank, marry a woman of this kind, he should be permitted to do so. The first step was the formal manumission of the intended spouse. And restrictions placed on the manumissions of slaves made it a little harder to formally manumit a slave under the age of 30. We suspect that many of these women would have been under the age of 30, as Roman women typically married in their late teens. So to carry out this kind of underage manumission, an owner had to present his slave before a council that was specially drawn up for these purposes, and offer a justification for the manumission. And our sources tell us that marriage was one acceptable justification for this kind of underage manumission. But there was also an additional step. The owner then had to swear before the council an oath that he would indeed carry out this marriage within 6 months' time. And it was the act of marriage within 6 months that activated the manumission. So until that happened, the woman was still not of free status. And if they didn't get married within 6 months, the manumission was inactive. She reverted to slave status, as did any children born in that period. So here we come to the first mechanism of control granted to patron husbands and not to other husbands. Whether or not the marriage took place was entirely in the hands of the patron. That is, the marriage did not require the woman's consent. Those who are unfamiliar with the Roman world might think, oh, well, the absence of a wife's consent to marriage, maybe that's not so historically significant. So I have to make the Roman context clear, and that is that consent mattered a lot. The entire concept of Roman marriage, legal marriage, was based on the principle that marriage was based on intent. It was freely entered and freely exited. So the absence of consent in these cases was significant enough that we get another jurist telling us, offering additional clarity about this law. So a patron cannot marry his freed woman against her consent. That is, if a woman is manumitted for whatever reason, that doesn't mean that she can be forced into marriage. This rule does not apply, however, where a patron emancipated a female slave, matrimonii causa, in order to marry her. This power then was not derived from patronage alone. It was not possible for a patron to force any of his freedwomen into marriage. The power to compel her into marriage was predicated on this perceived exchange. The woman given freedom for marriage owes marriage. What constituted this kind of manumission for the sake of marriage? Well, intent was most clear-cut in the underage manumissions that I mentioned, where you actually had to offer a justification before a council. But it's possible that a patron could also force a woman into marriage in a regular of-age manumission. So we hear that it was legal during a manumission for an owner to, and I quote, force his freedwoman to swear by oath that she would marry him. So this is potentially another way that at the moment of this transaction of the manumission, the patron could ensure that he would get marriage in return for offering freedom. And the mechanism that's used to compel marriage in this case, the swearing of an oath, is the same as that used for establishing what were called operae, which are duties required of a freedman or a freedwoman after their manumission. And these usually took the form of something like they had to bake bread for their patron, or perform carpentry or something. And they were a very important element of this continuing relationship between patron and freedman. Marriage, it seems, is conceptualized as an alternative type of opera, one that's only available to enslaved women. The correlation between marriage and opera is broached again in a different context. The position of women once the marriage was effected and she occupied the dual roles of wife and freedwoman. Freedwomen were typically excused from performing opera for male patrons if they married a third party. So once they became a wife, they no longer had to do these things for their patron. But if their patrons and husbands were the same person, that presents a problem. So in the early 3rd century, we hear again in our legal texts that a patron could not demand opera from his freed wife because he had raised her status, he exalted her rank by having married her. But the patron, although he could not be compensated by the performance of opera, did enjoy another form of remuneration. And I quote here, "You should be satisfied with the benefit of the law which provides that she cannot legally marry another without your consent." So the opera are replaced not simply by marriage, but by a marriage in which the balance is tipped in the favor of the husband's control, not only in the formation of marriage, but also in its dissolution. And the laws that constrained a freedwoman's freedom of action with regard to entering and exiting her marriage served to amplify what was already an existing inequality in the union. And so here we come to the third and final unusual aspect of marriages between patrons and freedwomen. These marriages were, in effect, marriages within a family. So by this period of time, most Roman marriages were free, meaning that the wife did not submit to the authority of her husband, but remained located within her natal family, under her father or grandfather's authority if he was alive. But a freedwoman, legally speaking, did not have a natal family, and it was her owner that most closely resembles her father legally and socially. So a freedwoman married to her patron, marries within her natal family. And the effects of this intersection between marital and natal family are most readily visible in the division of property. So in Roman law, spouses were supposed to keep their property separate, and this was a practice that offered some protection to women from the control of their husband, if not from the control of their natal family, potentially. But this separation was lost in marriages between freedwomen and patrons. Presumably, although it's never made explicit, the patron husband would inherit the freedwoman's property at her death. The patron also acted as the tutor, the financial guardian for their freedwomen, a role that gave them some control over financial transactions. So all sources of authority coalesced in one individual, placing freedwomen in a uniquely vulnerable position that, as we've seen, they didn't have the capacity to choose to enter or to exit. Okay, so I'm just gonna get rid of that. My overview of the legal position of freed wives has been necessarily brief, but I hope that it's enough to show that marriage was a route to manumission that changed both the nature of the marriage and the nature of the wife's freedom. And the question that remains for me is how qualified this freedom really was. And I think this gets to the title of our panel, which is bound, still bound?
Free yet bound.
Free yet bound. So were they still bound? The freedom of a woman manumitted through marriage is certainly more limited than that of other freed women. And indeed, by many contemporary definitions, this type of marriage would qualify as a form of slavery itself. That is, as slavery under the cover of marriage. The problem is that while the legal sources tell us that patron husbands had access to these special mechanisms of control, we have no evidence for how they might have been used in practice. So you might remember that Acti did manage to leave her husband, right? Did he do more than curse her, right? That's the evidence we have. Did he take legal action? We don't know whether he did. We don't know whether it would have been effective. So what I think we can recognize is that women freed through marriage occupied a middle ground between the poles of free and enslaved. So if freedom is associated with autonomy, with the ability to leave one's household of purchase, then freed wives were, legally speaking, not free. If, on the other hand, freedom was associated with promotion to a higher status within that same household, or what I'm particularly interested in, this transition of ties of ownership to ties of kinship, then, if we conceptualize freedom that way, freed wives were free. I think one of the most significant elements of freedom in a hereditary slave system was likely the ability to bear free children. I think you mentioned this yesterday, yeah. Freed wives did bear free children, but they didn't have the ability to choose the father of those children. I think then we must be attuned to the fact that a slave's gender, position in the household, childbearing status, and all of these types of features not only affected their chances of manumission, but the particular articulation of freedom that's available to them. Thank you.
Just going to do a quick switch. If you would like a clicker.
Oh, sure, thank you. You can use a very clicker.
So next up we have
The arrows.
Okay. Great.
Yesenia Barragan. So,
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out this morning. First, just wanted to thank Lee, Yato, and Tristan, and all the organizers for putting together this incredible conference. My name is Yesenia, and today I'm going to be sharing with you really, I think, what is the heart of my forthcoming book manuscript. So thanks for listening. Her name was Magdalena. We don't know how old she was when it happened, but we know that she was young, una joven, and that her tormentor, her master, believed it to be a moderate punishment, an otherwise reasonable correction for an infraction she had committed. And so her tormentor dragged her to the patio, tied up her feet and hands, and placed an iron bar under her thighs, a torture technique universally employed and perfected by the horrifying perpetrators of Atlantic slavery. There, in the stocks, Magdalena was left alone overnight, only accompanied by the constellation of stars and dangerous animals that roamed the village of Noanama, a remote settlement in the secluded riverine countryside of the Pacific lowlands of Colombia in the late 1840s. Perhaps one or more of the 5 witnesses who testified to Magdalena's torture that evening tried to comfort her. Perhaps it was the young indigenous woman who the judge eventually dismissed because she did not know her own age. It is this endless perhaps and perhaps and perhaps that collapse into my failure to tell what Sadea Hartman calls an impossible story, to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or might have been said or might have been done. By the morning, the damage was plainly visible. Magdalena emerged from the stocks, quote, with her left hand permanently disabled, dislocated and atrophied, bearing large scars on her hands. The news of the young Magdalena's torture scandalized local authorities so thoroughly that her tormentor was eventually imprisoned for 1 year. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, before the final abolition of slavery in Colombia in 1852, judicial authorities occasionally punished masters for excessively correcting their slaves, though these punishments were often light. But the difference here was that Magdalena, strictly speaking, was not a slave. She was a, quote, criada manomisa, which literally translates into a manumitted slave or servant, a term that referred to the children of the free womb, or the generation of children born to enslaved women after 1821 who were born legally, quote unquote, free, but bonded to their mother's masters until the age of adulthood. Another official even claimed that Magdalena was a, quote, helpless hija de familia, that is, as historian Nara Milanich notes, a minor daughter inserted within the household structure of affect and authority. Her legally distinct status as a child of the free womb and not a slave very likely motivated the court to sentence her tormentor to a year of imprisonment, a punishment that rarely occurred to excessively corrected slaveholders. Yet it was her very status as a quasi-slave, and as we'll see here, her status as an unfree commodity within a new debt-bondage economy that made her tormentor believe that he could freely break apart her body without consequence in the first place. This talk explores both the construction of and the calculating world made out of the free womb law, the central motor of a gradual emancipation policy in the newly constructed Republic of Gran Colombia, our nation encompassing present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. Over the course of what would be the final tumultuous months of the Wars of Independence against Spain in the northern Andes, representatives of Gran Colombia, many of whom were slaveholders, gathered together in the tropical savanna town of Cúcuta, Colombia, which you can see, they gathered in this church, you can still see it today, in 1821 to craft the future of the young nation. Many of Colombia's earliest and most sweeping liberal reforms were passed in this historic Congress. Chattel slavery, one of the most controversial and contentious legacies of Spanish colonial rule, was also on the negotiating table. And just to give you a sense of the scale of slavery in Colombia in 1825, there were nearly 45,000 enslaved people in Colombia, a population of about 1,135,000, or about 4% of the population. The vast majority were on the Pacific coast of Colombia where the gold mines were. And today, Colombia is the country with the third largest population of African descent, that is after the United States and Brazil. The law of the free womb, or La Ley de Libertad de Vientres, was the legislative solution to the problem of slavery in Gran Colombia, a solution inspired in large part by the relentless specter of an all-too-near Black Republic of Haiti. Designed to gradually abolish slavery through the wombs of enslaved women, the biopolitical project of the free womb law legislated that all children born to enslaved mothers would be declared legally free, but bonded to their mother's masters until the age of adulthood. And this law sought to gradually abolish the institution of slavery by destroying a legal doctrine that defined the very essence of chattel slavery, that is, partus sequitur ventrum, or the status of the child derives from the mother. This project, then, is indeed one of the earliest, in the words of Christina Sharp, quote, afterlives of partus sequitur ventrum in Colombia. However, Colombia was not alone in pursuing a policy of gradual emancipation in the Atlantic world. And here we can see a sort of bird's eye view of the policies overall. The first polity to pass such a law was Pennsylvania in 1780. The first wave occurred in the northeastern states of the United States, the second wave beginning in 1811 with Chile in the context of the Wars of Independence against Spain, and then the last wave in the late 19th century with the former Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and Brazil. Nevertheless, despite destroying the genealogical inheritability of chattel slavery in Colombia, the free womb law simultaneously birthed a new debt bondage economy resting on the technically free yet practically unfree circulation of child and youth quasi-slaves. In short, my project reveals how policies like the free womb law extended and reinscribed slavery through freedom. Determining the age of bondage for the children of the free womb emerged as the central subject of debate during the Congress in Colombia in 1821, an issue that was directly related to the question of debt and compensation to slaveholders. Delegates relied heavily on the racial numeracy of an assumed biological development cycle of enslaved peoples to make their case for establishing a particular period of bondage. So for example, José Félix de Restrepo, who was a lawyer from Western Colombia and the creator of the Gradual Emancipation law in Colombia, presented what he considered to be the standard life and work cycle of an enslaved youth in order to show that the children of the free womb could provide ample compensation to their owners despite their future emancipation, either at the age of 16 or 18. So Restrepo argued that the first 2 years of a slave's life imposed little costs on the master, while they would be able to perform small but important domestic tasks, such as running errands, transporting water to the kitchen, tending livestock, and entertaining small children from the age of 9 to 12. Once they reached the age of 12, which was a very important year for Restrepo and other slaveholders, the children were considered to be ready for hard labor, with Restrepo claiming that masters could retrieve at least double their investment until the child reached the age of 14. And then from 14 to 18 years of age, the investment, he argued, would quadruple. And in outlining this slave labor development cycle, Restrepo was actually applying longstanding ideas regarding age divisions of enslaved youth that was developed in the transatlantic slave trade. So we'll see here there are specific names talking about describing the particular age groups. So, and here we'll see that 12 again is an important year. The shift from muleque to mulecon. After several weeks of deliberation, Gran Colombian delegates voted to set the age of bondage to 18 years old. A controversial decision, 18 years of service was thereby deemed sufficient to repay the owners of female slaves for their, quote, precise obligation of educating, clothing, and feeding the children of all such female slaves. And the contract of debt was written into the law itself, as it stated that the children of the free womb, quote, shall be held, or better yet poached, to compensate the masters of their mothers for the expenses of their rearing by labor and service. Even more, the free womb law legalized the saleability of the children of the free womb by stipulating that any, quote, persons not of kin or strangers who desire to withdraw the child or youth, the offspring of a female slave, from the possession of the master of the mothers, could acquire such a child if they paid their master a, quote, just compensation for the food and support, which was called alimentos, to their mother's masters. That he may have supplied. In other words, strangers could purchase the children of the free womb before they reached the age of 18 by paying the debt incurred in alimentos to their mother's masters. And in so doing, the free womb law established a parallel market of child and youth quasi-slaves, whereby the children were codified as pawns in an emerging Colombian debt bondage economy. Whether accompanied by their enslaved mothers, siblings, or alone, the Colombian children of the free womb were transferable subjects whose alienation and commodification was made legible by the numbers of cows, pounds of jewelry, or pesos that preceded them in the clauses of the last wills and testaments, inventories, or dowries of Colombian slaveholders. Beginning in the 1830s, nearly 10 years after the law was passed, they began to appear in slaveholders' last wills and testaments. And at times they were listed alongside their mothers and siblings. And we're going to look at one will here by a it says will, a woman named Leonarda Palacios, and she was a single mother who owned various pieces of land, and she was also a slaveholder. And after declaring her various pieces of land, she claimed to own 4 slaves, who were named Jose Candido, Manuel Jose, Feliciana, and Ramona. And Ramona had 1 child of the free womb named Juan Jose, and another child very much free, or a child of the free womb as well, named Florencio. As capital, the children of the free womb, in conjunction with their mothers or other slaves, were also used as collateral in mortgages between affluent merchants. In 1839, one merchant owed 1,600 pesos to a man named Nicolas Bonoli, who was an Italian slave trader whose small slaving empire extended from the Pacific coast jungles of Colombia to Jamaica and Cartagena. As part of a pledge of repayment, the merchant mortgaged his slave Marcos, his wife Maria Antonia, and their daughter Mercedes, free by the law, in addition to another enslaved woman named Isabel and her daughter Venancia, who was also free by the law. Although the children were often purchased as a package with their mothers, they were occasionally bought and sold individually by non-kin, as I mentioned earlier, strangers, an act that further realized their natal alienation. The purchasing of the children required a special note of sale, functioning similarly to a property transfer rather than an outright purchase. The first record of this kind in the Pacific lowlands of Colombia, which is the region that I studied, appeared in 1835 under the heading Propiedad de una negrita libre por ley, or property of a young black girl free by the law. In the record, one female slaveholder sold to her fellow slaveholding sister a 7-year-old child of the free womb named Patrona for 40 pesos to compensate her for the debt incurred over the span of 7 years. The record declared that Patrona's former owner would henceforth, quote, desist, renounce, and transfer the property rights over La Negrita Patrona, which had been granted to her by the law of manumission. In slaveholder inventories, notes of sale, mortgages, last wills, and testaments, the children of the free womb circulated as distinct properties and unfree bodies of debt within the greater marketplace of slavery. Over the years of gradual emancipation from the free womb law in 1821 to 1852, when chattel slavery was finally and definitively abolished in Colombia, the imagined post-slavery order would be reimagined once again as Colombian slaveholders shifted the age of bondage in the early 1840s. After July 19, 1839, an entire generation of children born from enslaved women after 1821 were scheduled to turn 18, therefore allowing them to pursue a full freedom beyond their master's reach. But Colombia's first civil war, the War of the Supremes, would modify that timeline. And very briefly, this war was particularly feared by the slaveholding classes in Colombia because of the number of slaves who joined the rebel forces against the new republic. Amidst the onset of civil war, political pressure to modify the free womb law began to build. The age of bondage and thus compensation remained one of the unresolved questions for the master class. Finally passed on May 29, 1842, a system of concertaje was adopted, which was a mandatory apprenticeship program which was influenced by British emancipation, whereby the children of the free womb in Colombia would be forced to work under a suitable master until the age of 25, meaning 7 more years of forced labor. 10 years after this new law, in 1852, chattel slavery would be finally abolished in the nation of Colombia, and along with it, the free womb law. Perhaps joining her mother or sister or cousin or partner in early 1852, Magdalena would be finally freed from the grips of her tormentor's hold. Yet, the violence of gradual emancipation had been done. Magdalena would never have her left hand back, and undoubtedly so much more. Thank you.
And so finally, we have our final speaker for the panel, Enrique Martino.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thanks to the organizers. I'm also happy to have been part of this panel and to follow Yesenia's great paper, which helps contextualize my own paper. Because I kept the title a bit broad to get to the crux, and to also try to make bridges across kind of across time zones, time scales. But in reality, my paper it's very concrete. So it's about this part of the Spanish Empire in West Africa. Fernando Po was a Spanish colony. And it's curious because it's the equivalent of what Sierra Leone was to the British Caribbean, or what Liberia was to the US. So it was a late 19th century colony whose first settlers were freed slaves. So from Cuba, which was still the largest slaveholding colony in the late 19th century after Brazil, came a type of, through an apprenticeship program, kind of resettlement. But unlike Liberia and Sierra Leone, where there was a pretense but also a space for liberty, the Spanish proceeded to install a plantation colony on the African coast. And my research has been about the recruitment of labor locally at various points in the Gulf of Guinea. That was done on the basis of this first kind of founding contract of the Cubans who came, long, irrevocable, a type of semi-slavery. So that's the initial context. I'll read. So down the Strait of Gibraltar, past the Canary Islands and Western Sahara, hugging the coast and the illusory coast of inlets and deltas, the next two tall twin mountains imposing themselves as markers for seaborne navigators is in the Bight of Biafra, with the Mount Cameroon on the mainland and the adjacent volcanic peak of Fernando Po on the right side. This gate was a navigator's sign for having reached an outer place, a desolate, empty axis, quoting, at the extreme edge of the equatorial Atlantic doldrums, as Richard Burton, the British consul on the Spanish island, said in 1862. Up until that point, slave traders had actually always bypassed Fernando Po because of the baffling winds that had disabled their sails. The island was located in a gap at the inner margins of the West African and South Atlantic slaving and circulation systems, and was spared involvement in the transatlantic slave trade because of this and various other reasons, including the fact that, because of the resolute isolationism of its indigenous booby inhabitants, and because from the 1820s to the 1950s, armed with steamships and a lease from the Spanish crown, the British came as kind of naval merchant and missionary settlers as well, and abolitionists. And they set up this first settlement of Clarence in the early 19th century, and there lived several thousand former captives rescued from slave ships, who were joined by deserting slaves from Sao Tome, a nearby Portuguese island, and from literal African city-states such as Bimbia in Cameroon, who rowed themselves on the island on canoes, because it was this kind of it was an island where slavery didn't exist in the middle of almost the height of the transatlantic slave trade. When Spanish Jesuits started arriving to try to reclaim the island for the Spanish, there was alarm amongst this heterogeneous but free population, as Jamaican Baptist missionaries on the island had spread the rumor, quoting, that we, the Spanish, are coming with the sole objective of bringing slaves to kill and cannibalize, etc. What is hated most in Fernando Po is precisely slavery. Within a year of the first permanent Spanish government-sponsored expedition in 1858, the governor, Chacon, tried to reassure the population and declare slavery abolished. This was done before in Cuba and Puerto Rico, even though actually slavery was non-existent on the island and practically non-existent in the previous century. Nevertheless, the subsequent century of Spanish imperialism in Fernando Po and its buildup of large cacao plantations was characterized by contemporaries and academics as involving a labor regime, quote, that made the distinction between slave and contract worker at times no more than nominal. And this is from Ibrahim Sundiata, the historian who's written about this Fernando Po and the Bight of Biafra and the era of abolition. Fernando Po's plantations are sometimes placed alongside Sao Tome and the German plantations in Mount Cameroon, as part of the initiating of kind of a plantation colonies in West Africa in early colonialism. But it's actually more connected to the Spanish Antilles, to Cuba. Unlike the great Portuguese African empire, Spain had no political control over a hinterland, except Rio Muni, a small enclave on the mainland from the late 1920s on, from where it would administratively arrange for the supply of labor under new imperial regimes, type of imperial forced labor, taxation. This was most common in the British, French, Belgian empires, but the Spanish had no hinterland. So recruitment could not operate through militarized levy, and these were only imposed on the indigenous people in Fernando Po briefly and less effectively in comparison to free market labor recruitment, which I'll get into. So this kind of exceptional and unique confluence of circumstances meant that to get laborers onto its emerging plantations, it brought in a contract system devised in Cuba that could generate financial intermediation to arrange for informal labor recruiters to bring labor at a distance through a network of brokers and vessels and private recruiters, all informally arranged. So there was no treaty to contract laborers or to bring laborers, which is what the French did also in parts of French Congo and Dahomey. But the Spanish had to kind of devise a different system since. So when the plantations took off, really at the early 20th century, and they were kind of starting to surround the island and eventually kind of encompass it, the majority of recruited workers were actually Fang from an area of southern Cameroon, Rio Muni in Gabon. And it's an interesting case because, so over here, and this was also an area actually spared involvement in the slave trade. There was no kind of coastal kingdoms or militarized formations involved in the slave trade there. So the Fang kind of migrated there in the late 19th century, and they had actually they had avoided the slave trade and had little commercial tradition in comparison to West African societies with a long history of money and merchants and things like this. But they did form the primary labor force, which shows that there wasn't a continuity in forms of recruitment of slavery into contract labor. There was a kind of different underpinnings. So I empirically, it's this kind of elaborate ethnographic, historical kind of detail, but in summary, I could say that the Fang, they were kind of brought into the kind of new contract labor system through what the Spanish called enganche, or hook, which combined localized and only partially imperial recruitment networks. The recruiters were African, Creoles, some Portuguese, but they didn't have a military force behind them, so they couldn't operate with as much violence as previously. So they had to combine these two elements were the recruiters and a new urgency for money, which the recruiters would distribute as wage advances by the inclusion of imported commodities and colonial money into the reproduction of their own societies. And this is a switch that happens autonomously. It's not imposed from above. There's an acceptance of different new imported commodities, cloth, alcohol, and monies to translate into these commodities in order to reproduce essentially a matrimonial networks, which is the overarching and kind of structural feature of the Fang, decentralized lineage society. So following the flows of imported monies and a type of commercialization of social payments and ceremonial obligations such as Bridewealth, there's a clear contrast with the period of the slave trade and the colonial situation. Because many African scholars have highlighted that the commodification of social obligations during the slave trade was itself a supply of the slave trades, as Ugo Mbokeji in his book The Slave Trade and Culture in the Biafra has shown. In the early 19th century in Nigeria and the Igbo areas, a new class of creditors appeared and severe debt collectors to enslave defaulters on marriage payments. But this picture becomes a bit more unstable and reversible under colonial rule, when many more African societies became further exposed and fully appropriated the qualities of commercial money. And it's interesting because it can't be a coincidence that most of the laborers up to Fernando Po came from relatively egalitarian lineage societies with little history of the slave trade, where Bridewealth was astronomically high. And this is the case actually also of the Igbo in Nigeria in the 20th century, and previously, for example, the Kru in Liberia, or Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, what became Liberia. How much time do I have?
9 minutes.
9 minutes? Oh, okay. Not much time is left. Let's see. This is just to get a sense of the... So forms of labor control after slavery and the devices colonial powers introduced to overcome abolition and their need for labor, such as penal, tributary labor, debt-bondage, indentureship, apprenticeship, obligatory contracts, have been extensively studied in African and Atlantic transitions away from slave labor. One of the most impressive assessments is it's a French book by Jan Mulier-Boutang, titled D'esclavage au salariat. Here he defines that the primary feature of this transition was the mutation of slavery into various things, but amongst others, labor under contract. And this under contract was part of a kind of long sunset informed by the dismantling of slavery. And in the case of Fernando Po, this is quite backtrackable, quite traceable to the history of kind of the fragmentation of Cuban slavery, the lack of, the time frame, the legal definitions of the contract as a type of apprenticeship, obligatory, irrevocable, not voluntary. As soon as you arrive on the island, you had to make a contract, because it was defined as a contract with the state. So people who arrived were usually immigrants. They didn't come in families. Even the immigrants, they came kind of alone. So they were, the state defined itself as the kinless would now belong to the state. So that was the justification for the kind of obligatory contracts. Contracts in slavery, they form an unsettling pairing. They can neither be historically separated nor identified with each other, in spite of the proximity and intermingling, and in spite of the analogous presence of severe violence on the work site, and the analogous commercialization of recruitment of contract labor. So there's a lot of missionaries, especially, that are kind of obsessed with recognizing slavery again after its abolition. So people are being sold by recruiters to the planters, or plantation regimes like slavery, because there's kind of quite how do you say, abuse with impunity and private abuse. Although most of the abuse gets nationalized, so the police takes over the discipline, but it's the same type of torture. But the juxtaposition of contracts and slavery is most unsettling, because plantations were and could be worked on by both without interruption, from slavery to contract labor, but with an inverted premise: voluntary or involuntary displacement. And then this is a problem, because in the absence of being able to generate a slave market, of organizing an internal predatory subjugation of tribute laborers, what indentured labor allowed was for the displacement of labor through individualized debts, and never more than a few dozen transport merchants and brokers. And yeah, this is the character of labor recruitment, not only in Fernando Po, elsewhere too in plantation colonies, that people would return. They wouldn't expect to be to become landholders or self-employed afterwards. They were keen on going back home with their earnings, and this is what marked the logic and character of recruitment. And this is what also marks the kind of unstable history of labor recruitment, because after every few years, between 2 and 5 years was the contract, laborers needed to come from somewhere else. People didn't come back. They didn't make a career as laborers. They made their money and either found other places to make an income or became cash crop farmers. So there's this kind of dynamic of recruitment that is continuous, always hooking in kind of new societies and new people, but the same recruiter couldn't operate in the same area twice. And then, so contracts, people were intending to return, but nevertheless the type of contracts and the kind of asocial subordination as defined by them, this kind of obedience, it's kind of inscribed in the contract, this unquestionable obedience to orders, was experienced as a type of slavery, as plenty of petitions from workers and worker representatives in the archives say. So for example, in 1931, kind of Fang chiefs from the coast, they say, inside the island of Fernando Po, the treatment is the same as that of a slave. In the jails it's worse, the raids on vagrants, etc. But nevertheless, the process of recruitment was radically different, because it involved this release of almost the total sum wages of the contract in the form of an advance, which is also the way the Fang were demanding their money as a type of advance, so it could immediately translate into a kind of into a gain. So labor recruitment could not operate through direct relations of political domination, but only through the intense commercialization of both intermediation. So there was a large army of recruiters taking their commission, which was kind of misread as a type of new slave traders emerging, and the intense commercialization of social life. And actually recruiters, they were most effective in societies that were in a kind of peripheral, marginal colonial space, that were still, semi-colonized and kind of self-determined, because even when kind of conquest fully happens in the Kru and Fang areas in the 1930s, then the type of labor becomes forced labor, infrastructure for the government, and things like this, so then actually labor recruitment ceases. And then, but then, yeah, so there's a kind of history of not really a type of resistance, but a type of continued autonomy at its margins, even while subjecting yourself to a kind of a new colonial labor regime. This kind of aspects of self-determination actually didn't allow colonial powers, because they were expecting to create a kind of long-term, dependable labor force, but then the fact that the value of social economies was ever escalating, it meant that the kind of wage labor economy just wasn't enough to cover people's expectations and needs, so people came up with all other ways of making money except labor, contract labor, because there was actually quite small sums of money, which was the whole point of a contract, to keep down labor costs. So then there's this kind of aspect of resistance through money as well. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
My website, where I have sources and things like that.
Well, I'd like to invite the presenters back up here. So I have to say, the thing that I found most interesting about this panel, and this is, I guess, it's kind of selfish because it's something that I've really been interested in thinking about recently, is this issue of debt, basically, and how debt kind of intersects with the idea of slavery, or what debt's relationship is to the idea of slavery. And if you're anything like me, when you hear debt and slavery, your mind goes, first to, okay, well, someone falls into debt and then they're enslaved. But what I think all of these three papers do, and do really well, is show how complex this relationship is, thinking both about the onset of slavery, but also a release from slavery as well, how this idea of debt exists in kind of nuanced ways, and how it shapes the institutions or institutions itself. So I guess a selfish question I would pose to the panel, and I know that this has already come up in your papers as well too, but in your own work, where do you see the idea of debt kind of shaping how we understand slavery, or the release from slavery, or perhaps why is debt such kind of an integral part of this discussion? So I don't know, any more thoughts or anything that you want to share?
Well, I want to hear what you have to say.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm sort of nervous that I'm just going to be repeating what I just presented. So maybe you can talk, and then I can sort of think through.
Okay. Yeah, I think, so in the case of Roman slavery, I think that for a long time it's been understood that, manumission didn't have to be purchased, but could be compensated for by this continuing relationship between a free person and a patron. That's very easy to see in cases when the freed person does particular forms of labor after they're freed. It's often was the case that business agents slaves were freed in order to act as business agents. So what I'm interested in doing is moving beyond that sort of stereotypical example of the slave freed to be a business agent, to look at what other kinds of sort of work was performed after the release from slavery that continued to compensate the former owner.
Or if I could be specific, I guess, thinking about Enrique, right? Thinking about not just, I guess, not slavery as being the result, or bondage perhaps maybe being the result of debt, but almost being the result of credit. And does that change the way that we think about it? If people are if people are going into this without possibly, or in some cases, a financial debt, but looking forward as an advance, as a way of paying social debts, right? And does this change how we understand, kind of contract labor in the situation?
Yeah, because the debt has a bad rap. It's a source of domination, of control, of subordination. But in the archive, people seek out debts. People are actually looking for creditors. And once recruiters come and give out monies as an acceptable currency, then people don't really care about the recruiters. They care about fulfilling their social obligations, which is, for example, a lot of the recruiters, they were paying for the divorce of a sister or of a mother, because you need to compensate debts. So debts are already created within the internal dynamics of the society. But it's not necessarily always related to labor. It's more related to obligation, to a sense of of community. Whereas capitalism turns debt into a way of extracting labor from people. So it moves people away for a few years and kind of makes them pay off their normal, ordinary debts through kind of exploitation in a separate space. So I suppose debt can become easily co-opted by capitalist accumulation, but it's not necessarily something that always ends up in a kind of in a self-imploding or engulfing situation, because debt is also part of the qualities of relatedness. So.
If I could, the other thing I was thinking about yours too, Yesenia, is again this idea of how debt might play into the conversation, or obligation, when thinking about kind of full emancipation versus gradual emancipation, and the way they're thinking about how slavery is going to end, not just for the individual, but for the kind of larger society as well. Any thoughts about that, or?
Yeah, well, one thing that actually I think Enrique that made me sort of think about, I mean, what's really interesting about this period of gradual emancipation in Colombia, which I'm studying, is, as I mentioned before, there was this process by which non-kin or strangers can purchase the children of the free womb, and essentially they would be paying off the debt, right, incurred by their new masters. But what I didn't talk about in this presentation was that the law also made it possible for parents to pay off the debt of their children of the free womb, just because I didn't have a lot of time to get into it. So it's interesting to think about the possibilities that actually that debt created for enslaved or free black parents to purchase back their children. I mean, I say possibilities because essentially paying off alimentos was cheaper than paying off the possession of an enslaved person. So for example, a 7-year-old child would cost 40 pesos to pay off the compensation, but on the slave market, had that child been born a slave, they would have cost most likely 120 pesos. And so it's an interesting kind of contradictory world that it creates. Yeah. This new, yeah.
Well, are there questions here? Let's say here. How about first in front?
Very general question, actually, which also goes out to the whole panel, and maybe also to and to everyone. Something that didn't really come up so far in the conference was discussing the definition of slavery, what actually it is, and all of these presentations share or make a similar irritation, namely that operating on the dichotomy of free and unfree, which is so common today in discussing slavery, gets very difficult once you look into the material, right? And Yesenia, you had this distinction. There was slavery, then there was limited time spans of slavery. In Rome, you didn't only have free and unfree, right? You had very different types of freedom and degrees of freedom. What was the essence there? How of slavery? What was that defined? You can't go by the term, right? They didn't have the term. You had salvos, you had ancilla, you had all these different kinds of slaves. Freed women who weren't fully free, but who was fully free. Not everyone who was fully free was fully free in what we would, right? And then different types of bondage. So what I'd really like to know more about is what in your work you consider to be the essence of slavery, the defining characteristics, and how to kind of assemble the different phenomena you discuss under this term.
That's a big question. It reminds me actually of your paper, which both of you I loved, where you're talking about the inadequacies of terms like enslaved and free.
Yeah, I think that the more I've studied slavery in the ancient world, the more I've come to be dissatisfied with those terms, because there are so many in-between statuses. So freed wives are just one category. There's slaves of kin, slaves owned by slaves, people who are considered free in life but slaves in death. I mean, just endless numbers of different types of statuses. And I think that you can look at a very strict legal definition of what a slave is, but if you try to place that in the social world, it becomes really inadequate. And I think the biggest issue for me is that, as we talked about yesterday with ancient evidence, is that I don't have a sense of what an enslaved person would say is the nature of their servitude.
John,
yeah.
As you said, you can't just look at the legal text. Well, for Rome, you can't. You cannot, because they don't use the term slave. They have many different terms. So what is the approach to assemble all these different kinds of what we call slavery in one category?
I think that in Roman law, there's a very defined category of slave. I mean, one of the first things that you get in compilations of law is there are free people and there are slaves. Those are the two major categories of people, right? And then they admit, well, there are also freed people. But I think that legally speaking, it's actually quite distinct. I just don't know how well that maps onto the social world. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I would agree fully. Enrique, any thoughts about the definition of slavery?
Well, because I had to deal with the issue of the revival, of the specter of a revival of slavery, which kind of kicks off in kind of this severe exploitations in African colonies, which is called modern day slavery, and the language of today is rooted in this colonial period. But it's a type of misrecognizing and a conflation. Slavery becomes a variety of different things, and then, unrelated to actually previous forms of slavery, which were much more predatory and voluntary, because even debt bondage today, it's classified as slavery in the modern slavery index, but it's similar relationships of kind of dependency, financial needs, family situations, and things like this. So that's kind of my problem, was to not become dependent on the rhetorics of slavery, which is a political move for NGOs today, basically.
Okay, other questions? Rosia.
My question's for Pat. And I'm curious, just to complicate the scenario a little bit. So the case in which a freed person purchases their slave spouse and then manumits them.
Yeah.
So how does that complication fit into the thinking that you've done about these people?
So one thing that I didn't get into is that the backgrounds of these different relationships that might end up as being described on an inscription as a patron and husband or freed woman and wife are extremely diverse. So in some cases, it seems that those people, the reason that they have these double ties of kinship is because there was a pre-existing union. One of them was freed before the other, and as you were saying, they bought their partner out of slavery and therefore became the patron in name, at least. In other cases, and we know this because these epitaphs are often found on the frontiers of the Roman world, the patrons who are buying these women and then freeing them to be married to them are soldiers. They were never enslaved in their life, and almost certainly the relationship began in the context of a master-slave dynamic. So what's interesting to me is that surely the sort of significance of this proprietary relationship had really different meanings in these different kinds of relationships, and yet in our evidence they all appear sort of under the same title. They all appear in the epitaphs in the same way, and so we can't really distinguish between them, and that makes it very interesting to me, because obviously it would have, in lived experience, been an extremely different situation.
I saw a question up there.
Thank you all for your papers. I had a question kind of building off of the debt discussion for Yesenia. And I was interested if you could say a little bit more about some of the children who were born under the free womb law. What happened to them after they came of age? And so, for example, did they receive freedom dues or something like that? Did they turn to wage labor or, peasant farming? I'm just wondering, or whether they were reinscribed into relations of debt, which I think Matthew maybe was thinking of. So just eager.
Right. I wish I knew the answer, but the archive does not give me anything, really. And I think that might be sort of an answer, actually, in terms of the disappearance of the children of the free woman. That might be actually telling of I would hope, fulfillment of full freedom, meaning that the state could no longer really control their whereabouts. And so once they reach the age of 18, they would, formally speaking, have to show themselves before the what were called manumission juntas, or local councils of honorable men, typically the mayor and the notary and so forth of their local village where they lived, prove that they had been honorable to their master. I haven't found any cases where the children were essentially bonded back to their masters for any sort of, any behavior that was not fulfilling of their duties as children of the free womb. So it's hard to say. The region that I study is on the Pacific coast of Colombia, which was a very rural region with literally hundreds of rivers, jungles, and there were historic runaway enslaved settlements throughout, particularly the northern lowlands of Colombia. And so it's an interesting region to look at because there was a huge challenge of imposing wage labor in the post-emancipation period. And in fact, in my book manuscript, I'm looking at essentially what I'm calling a strike that occurs right after 1852, where essentially all the black folk of this region just simply refused to perform any kind of labor for the former enslaved white slaveholding class. So yeah, I wish I could tell you more, but perhaps the archive doesn't really, it's telling of something. I'm hopeful that this generation of youth, we're no longer within the grips of the master class. Yeah.
Thank you again for your presentations. My questions for Yesenia. When you were talking about the genealogical inheritability of slavery, you said that it often led to what I believe you referred to as natal alienation. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that idea or concept.
Right. So what I was talking about was, when I said the genealogical inheritability of slavery, I was talking about the, we were talking about the Roman legal...
the partus sequitur ventrum.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I have learned is not this kind of...
Yeah, we have an overlapping interest in this topic.
Yeah. Her forthcoming article is going to be awesome about it. In any case, so I was referring to that, which is essentially what made chattel slavery legally possible, that legal doctrine. And so what I was talking about was with natal alienation specifically, was looking at the children of the free womb. So they were no longer enslaved precisely because the argument goes that their mothers birthed free, quote unquote, citizens in the making. And so, nevertheless, as I show, they were sold as separate objects of debt on essentially on the slave market. And so what I was interested in looking at is the natal alienation that's produced when, even though in the separability of the mother and child. Just really briefly, what's really interesting is that the law of the free womb, what it says is that the mother had the right to claim, hold on to their child of free womb until the child was reached the age of puberty. And so what I look at in my book are these really interesting lawsuits, essentially, where the mother is fighting for very specific kind of definitions of puberty. But that's another kind of story.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question kind of for the entire panel. We talk about different aspects of slavery and post-slavery system. Would you say, so the systems that emerge post-slavery, would you argue that these systems are more cruel than the original, or do they maintain a certain level of cruelty that's consistent across? They just maybe change certain aspects? And also, are there certain protections or certain new criteria that formerly enslaved persons can now use to, say, fight for newer rights? So, for example, with Katharine, so the children born during the marriage of post-manumission are legitimate, and so they may escape slavery for that next generation as opposed to the children before. So, yeah, those two.
Well, it depends on the area, and I would say what I tried to say with this kind of fragmentation of slavery, it's that aspects are a continued intensification of exploitation, overseer violence, state discipline, even kind of planter's ideology doesn't change that quickly. And legally, statuses change, but then realities are usually informal. Most justice happens outside the courts, because it's informal, it's private, in these type of colonial settings. But it's an open question. I think it's clearly informed, or the backdrop is there, and people's metaphor is slavery. So that's why even in kind of in colonies of severe exploitation, such as the Congo or in kind of French West Africa, people use slavery even though they're told that technically it's over, but then their experience of the situation, disempowerment, violence, the metaphors that they use in the 20th century is a kind of slavery, but it's another. They also have other words, so it's more important to include their entire vocabulary. But that forms part of the backdrop, so to say.
Tristan.
So yesterday, one of the big discussions was the relationship of the archive to literature, and so I have some sense of how that plays out with Roman slavery, but since you didn't use any literature other than, I would be loath to call legal writing literature, but I'm willing to entertain that argument. This is more for the other two panelists. If literature, since I don't know anything about your historical context, if literature can be synthesized with the archive in any meaningful way.
Hers was nice, really.
Yeah, I think obviously Sade Hartman would say things far more better than I would. Well, literally speaking, I think that I try to, as much as possible, kind of take hold of a literary imagination in my work, precisely because I refuse to kind of take the master's word for it. This is the, master's archive that all of us are, in some shape, way, or form, are trying to work through, right? I'm certainly in my own, I guess theoretically, I'm deeply kind of influenced by Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharp and Marisa Fuentes, and folks who are really kind of digging through the problematics of the archive, and what I think Christina Sharp talks about, the archival hold, and pushing back against that. But that's, I think, something that I'm really trying to work through. And I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that. I'd love to hear more. Yes?
This is just a totally random question, which is probably a stupid one, but because you mentioned one of the architects of the free boom law, the Jose Felipe Restrepo. He's not an ancestor of Laura Restrepo. Speaking of literature, is he?
Restrepo, I don't know.
How uncommon is the name? Because if we're talking about literature as an escape from the master's archive, she's like a really well-known Colombian novelist.
In Colombia, actually, so one of the figures I study is George Isaac. Jorge Isaac. George Isaac is a very important slaveholder, Jewish, English, Jamaican slaveholder who comes to the Pacific coast of Colombia in the early 19th century. Essentially, his son writes Maria, which is this kind of, it's the quintessential Spanish romantic novel of the 19th century. It's terrible. But it's this kind of slave apologist kind of literature. So I do incorporate that. That's a very concrete example.
Great. Okay. Well, we've reached the end of our time here. So another round of applause, please, for our panelists.